Hi, thanks for that. I'm Professor Pat Langdon, Director of the Transport Research Institute, and also Professor of Inclusion and Engineering Design at the same time. So I have a very wide brief to my background, and I would say a multidisciplinary brief. My goal in my research is concerned with transport itself, zero carbon aviation particularly, and human factors and AI in the design of autonomous vehicles. So I have a very specific set of technology skills, if you like, and the contribution that we're going to have here will reflect that the skills of all of the different and the backgrounds of all the different various participants. And those participants are Jane Ali Knight, who is Professor of Festival and Event Management at Edinburgh Napier University, and Catherine Bright, who is Director of Transportation Planning for WSP. And they will be talking themselves about their individual contributions to this panel. We also were billed having Deji Narayan, Manager for Mobility and Placemaking at Edinburgh Council, but unfortunately she's been having to take a COVID test and is unable to join us. But we'll try and represent a little bit of the notes that she sent us about that area that she's interested in. So firstly, I should recognise that I, as Director of the Transport Research Institute, we have been forced in recent years to recalibrate our understanding of what transport research should be, and certainly what it would be for the next 5 years. And that has been really cast as a horizon gazing exercise, and has led us to redefine some of the areas of research. But also, it's led us to a very interesting and important realization, which transport is not a subject in its own right. It is actually a multidisciplinary subject or an interdisciplinary subject that will bring together very different areas of research and of interest in order to be able to solve societal problems. And I think at this very moment in time, there's a number of different drivers for that. And that includes, obviously, climate change, but also includes new technology innovation, which is beginning to drive integrated thinking, say, between, for example, the built environment and engineering of different sorts, but also in terms of legislation and policy frameworks. And indeed, you can't really consider modern technology without consider environment and health. And environment of health, of course, leads also linking to inclusion for various reasons, but certainly in terms of disability and impairment. And that, of course, leads us all to behavioural change and issues such as societal contexts. I don't think that we can bring solutions together without operating in a multidisciplinary way. And certainly, we should be thinking interdisciplinary, so we should have a research that actually addresses these issues together and not in separation. And that sort of joined up thinking has been the theme of various panels before now, I noticed, or it's emerged. But we have a duty to look at that as well. So there are a number of issues where that sort of a number of research areas where that approach is actually pretty evident. But I think the main one, from our perspective, being in the School of Engineering and the Built Environment, is how, for example, built environment considerations need to be considered at the same time as behavioural considerations, and at the same time as new technologies, which will be key to new forms of transport. Those new technologies, of course, lie in different areas, but the main area is, for example, new communication technologies that would allow greater connectivity between vehicles and between vehicles and the infrastructure. And therefore, the infrastructure design and build has to be built around that to some extent, but with the understanding of those technologies. And that links to the behavioural change, because behavioural change is likely to be involved when we consider the increasing use of autonomous vehicles, whether they be personal transport, whether they be freight, or whether they be, in fact, buses, for example, public transport and so on. So these integrated issues need to be addressed, and ultimately, I suppose, we would want to move to an interdisciplinary field, and that, of course, is reflected to some extent in the teaching of the Transport Research Institute, which teaches a master's in transport as well. I've identified a few issues myself. I think follow on from and these issues are issues that we directly address in the Transport Research Institute, and therefore I think they're probably good exemplars of this multidisciplinary approach as it stands at the moment. So in the first instance, with inclusion, and by inclusion I really mean not just social inclusion, but inclusion in terms of disability, and disability is the result of impairment in society. Inclusion is a far more difficult area to address than one would think, and aspects of this which have caused difficulty is the definition of what constitutes a design for inclusion. Designing for inclusion has in the past been associated with wheelchairs and white sticks. However, it is very clear from previous research and also statistics that actually there's a huge base of the pyramid in this area of people with different impairments. And those impairments could be functionally classified, for example, into hearing, vision impairments, physical movement impairments, and thinking and cognition impairments, and of course things like locomotion, and ability to walk as well. And when you consider that, and this comes as a surprise to some people, when you consider that there are over 1 million people in Scotland who are 65 years or over, it brings home the necessity to consider the effects of aging on people's capabilities. And so this is not to say that everybody is impaired if they're greater than a certain age, but what it means is there are increasing levels of capability reduction with age, and that, of course, varies with gender and, for example, other issues. So inclusion is about understanding how that population is the real population we need to address when we design our public transport and our other transport networks and our roads, for example, even to the extent of including active travel, cycling, and so on. All has to be encompass that full range of capabilities in the base of that pyramid. So inclusion is an area that I specialise in, but it's also part of our work in transport research. We look at that in conjunction with many areas, not just policy, but also the design of infrastructure and technology. Popularising novel transport paradigms, such as mobility as a service, which is basically the idea of mobility accessible to you at the time you need it, where you need it, and not necessarily a case of ownership, is a much harder issue than people think. And again, this is an area where it's very easy to construct a concept. It's much harder to bring that concept to realization in reality. And this is one of the areas where Edinburgh Napier University specializes in high impact research, close to the reality of implementation. And the sort of issues that you have to consider if you're working in this area is how can you bring together disparate companies and services who are not necessarily natural collaborators in order to ensure a seamless experience, an MAAS experience, where somebody, for example, can book a door-to-door journey with multiple transport types. That's great to talk about in principle, but it's much harder in practice. And I think Napier and TRI works very hard at the level of high impact practice. Another area we're working on at the moment addresses aviation. And it addresses it from the perspective of green aviation. We are working currently on the HEART project, which is a project driven by the development of electrically powered planes using hydrogen fuel cells to drive them. And they are proposed to be operating in a sub-regional network. And that sub-regional network implies, as you would expect, very relatively small planes operating over relatively short distances. And they are green. They use green hydrogen, and the plan is that they will be green. So comparing that hydrogen-based aviation, which is under test currently in the air at the moment over the UK, with other forms of transport is tricky because most of them are far from being green and have significant carbon dioxide costs. And we are engaged in calculating, for example, some of the typical routes and the typical mode of routes necessary in islands, and the islands, including things like ferries and so forth, and comparing them with the human understanding, or rather the human behavioural change that might occur if people use this sort of service, which has the potential to be fantastically more attractive than existing aviation services around the world. Another area of importance is the road infrastructure and how that is currently able to support proposed developments of transport and transportation. I think one of the most important things to think about here is actually in terms of the debate nationally generally about the technology and whether the technology can be made to work. But in reality, as an engineering issue, you have to start at the very lowest levels with the paint on the road. And that is indeed what we are doing. And that is a different perspective from, for example, advertising a complex technology that would be fully automated that might exist sometime in the next 5 to 10 years, but in fact is not actually a proven technology, even at low technology readiness levels. And if you're going to do this, then you need to understand, for example, how an automated or autonomous vehicle will be able to navigate its way through urban streets as well as rural ones, of course. And to do that, it may have to interact with, by visually, or rather using a camera system to analyze the road. If it does that, it needs to understand more fully what the objects are in the road. And at the present time, there is no coherent structure to a lot of our city streets. And so that needs to be considered, and the way in which we paint our roads will be probably of great importance to that. But like I said at the beginning, the reasons we would be interested in that in a multidisciplinary way is that it could be strongly linked to connectivity to the infrastructure, so that the vehicles would be linked into an understanding of how much traffic there was, what the demand was, and what the situation was at any given time. I'm trying to illustrate the multidimensional complexity of these issues with a few case studies here. I think it's important also to understand that people are reluctant to adopt new technologies, and that's been shown in many different areas. Autonomous vehicles is one, and an important thing to understand is that that is a good response to a lack of experience and lack of understanding of what's actually going to be offered in terms of technology and service. So another area we are currently researching is understanding how the public changes its behavioural patterns based on what it understands about, or what it's exposed to, what they're exposed to, what people are exposed to in terms of their media, in terms of their social contacts, and in terms of their interaction with their immediate needs for travel, for example. So the basis of that is actually effectively survey techniques and understanding better how people change their views when they're exposed to safe, modern engineering technologies like, for example, hydrogen-fueled aircraft. Another area, and probably the final area I'm going to touch on, is the area of COVID. Clearly, there's been a massive effect of COVID on transport. Everybody will be aware of the fact that public transportation has been severely affected by that, and also that we are now currently in a post-COVID phase, which doesn't necessarily resemble pre-COVID in terms of the number of journeys carried out in different transport modes, but also in terms of the reason why people travel in and out of cities, and also the reason why people need to travel in rural areas. Again, rural areas, not necessarily the first thing you think of when you think about new possible technologies for future travel, but those areas are actually considerable. And because of patterns of behaviour change resulting from COVID, which we have to some extent been addressing in our research, then that's quite important to understand how that might change. At the moment, there's a lot more working from home, likely that there will be a lot more of that in the future. But I think also there's a very important issues as to why people use cars, since the majority of car users are pretty happy with their circumstance, and they will see it as safer in many ways than other forms of transportations. So there's technology issues mingled with social issues, mingled with planning and policy frameworks, and also in the background, advancing change in technology. And so all of these issues can't be and shouldn't be dealt with separately. They need to be dealt with as integrated problems. And that's what we're trying to achieve in transport research. So those are some of the main issues that I thought I'd touch on before moving on with the debate, if you like, in terms of what are the most serious or important issues that we need to understand. So moving on to our speakers, I'd like to introduce Catherine Bright, Director of Transportation Planning at WSP Consultancy, who has a background working in transport planning on behalf of the public sector. Catherine, would you like to take over?
Thanks very much, Pat. That was a really good introduction. So I'm Catherine Bright. I work for WSP, which hopefully all of you know because we've sponsored the event, but it is a multidisciplinary engineering consultancy. My background is in transport planning and always largely on the public sector, so kind of looking for ways in which our clients, local authorities, can secure funding from the government to deliver transport improvements. I've got a real active interest in the future of transport and that sort of challenge about how we can provide transport networks in those rural areas. I live in the middle of nowhere in the far southwest, so a long way away from most of you guys. But it's kind of thinking about how we can get that rural mobility connected so that we can move forward in a more net zero way. I've got lots of interest in how that future kind of transport develops, and also I've been speaking to a lot some of my clients around that the question that we've been given today about the priorities to keep that global economy going whilst also moving forward to a transport network that is more aligned with net zero, because I think we're, as a transport network, we're still quite a long way away. It feels like we're all quite happy to talk about it, but the actions and the change that we need to take is still not quite there. I feel that the key priority for me is really those changing behaviours and how we get people to change, and I think that the net zero is there in people's hearts and minds, and they know that it's important, but ultimately they're still going to get in a car to drive somewhere because possibly it's easier. And I think it's quite interesting what Pat was just saying about the car and about it being easy to travel in that way. It is the first choice. People still see cars as a status symbol. They still see it as a sign of success, and how do we change that and kind of bridge that across all the different types of people across all the different communities that we all have is a really tricky question to have. And we've been talking quite a lot internally when I was preparing for this with some of my colleagues about that. How do you get people to change their behaviours? How do you get them to kind of to realise the importance of that journey? I think that the whole kind of freight network, what we've done in COVID, where the amount of van drivers is probably, certainly where I live, gone up considerably with those Amazon Prime deliveries that we all want. Do we all need it next day? Probably not. But because we have it and it's free, may as well make most of it, type thing. But those decisions that we're making because you can and you want it, and that they're kind of cost implicated, doesn't quite tally up with that whole net zero approach, where maybe you could kind of consolidate your deliveries into one day. Maybe you consolidate all the packaging. Maybe you could kind of reduce the amount of van drivers coming in and out of the village every day, because by just kind of thinking a bit more sensibly about things. It always amazes me that the Sainsbury's delivery man, that other supermarkets are available, will come to my house maybe, and then an hour later the same guy will be next door, but for some reason no one's kind of joined the dots to kind of make them go from one house to the next without kind of driving around lots. So I feel like there's some way that we can go with that. I also think that if you know, we still want our holidays, we still want people to go, we still want to go abroad, and I'm not sure people are really ready to kind of truly think about that global mindset around the net zero piece. I think, like I said, we're happy to talk about it. I'm not quite sure if all of our actions necessarily are aligned with what we're preaching. So I think that's largely where I wanted to come from. I also wanted to just touch on the political side of it as well, because I think we've got massive decisions that we are having to make around transport related issues, and they still largely come down to local politicians having to stand up and put schemes forward and support them. And in my experience, it takes a very brave local person to stand up and say, I'm going to remove all that road going through the town centre. We're going to remove cars from that to make it more accessible, to make it more suitable for public transport, to kind of allow those active travel measures to kind of increase. It's a brave person that does that within that political cycle, and I feel like those people need much more support centrally from government to allow them to do that more successfully. So I think, Pat, is that enough for the minute?
Catherine, no, I think that's a fantastic summary of what are some key issues, and it's interesting how it's emerging as well. I mean, one area which I personally are very much interested in is this rural divide. I mean, the reason why people are very keen on their cars in rural areas is because very often they have no choice. I mean, it's a matter of survival. It's not a matter of choice. And if you get rural tourism, as I'm sure Jane will be able to talk about in a little while, there, tourists coming in from far and wide, whether international or within the UK, that actually distorts that pattern in ways where you get, Tesco delivery or Asda deliveries or, going on because of tourist, demand as well as local demand. And the key thing is that nobody would conceive. I think that something like 2% of people in rural areas, would not conceive of getting rid of their vehicle because they just can't do that. So those people are contributing to the statistics that people see their car as a safe zone, yet that has the capability of providing them a door-to-door service in what may be quite bad weather areas in the rural. So the whole debate may be distorted by focus on cities, which are clearly more easy in terms of eliminating personal vehicles, and also more susceptible to things like MAS or other alternative schemes for decarbonisation. So that's a fantastic points that you make there. And the other thing I would respond to, I think, which is really interesting also, is this issue of politics. So we do study this, and politics and so on is part of and planning is part of our remit. I think an interesting area here is that politics appears to be trying to catch up. I think you're right. There is a general conservatism about transportation planning. And that could be a problem we have to overcome as one of our first priorities in terms of moving quickly. We now have to change a lot of our priorities because of global warming and zero carbon. And I think, there's no room for very conservative politics that trundles along at a pace where years go by and nothing is really done. So there may have to be changes in that area. And there's no blame attached here. It's simply a difference in priorities, I think. So it's great that you mentioned that. And I think that affects all manner of things. It affects whether how and whether you do put paint on the road at any given point in our cities, for example. But I think it's also equally as important as to whether we have rural bus services that are adequate, and so on. So that's how I would take that debate on. I don't know, Jane, do you have any comments on that at all?
I'm going to focus more on festivals than tourism, but I can pick up on tourism in any questions later. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think we can go to you as the next speaker. So, by all means, shall I introduce you? I think you can introduce yourself.
No, I'm fine. So, hello, everybody. My name's Jane Ali Knight, and I'm a professor in festival and event management here in the business school at Edinburgh Napier University. And I suppose that's a great thing to say, first of all, in terms of being interdisciplinary, that we've got people on this panel that cover different parts of the university, but we're all facing similar challenges. So I'd like to start today by highlighting two recent BBC news articles. So the first one was on the 6th